Flying Wing was unlike any aircraft that had yet been developed. It had no fuselage, no long central body such as were to be found on all other aircraft. It had no tail, no orthodox vertical fin or rudder, no horizontal stabilizers or elevators as were found on ordinary airplanes. It was purely and simply a long, slippery-looking wing. It carried its cargo and its crew inside that wing. It employed different techniques of control. More about that in a moment. One could stand upright in the wing, and this reporter did so when he worked on the story more than 30 years ago. The pilot, co-pilot, engineer, and bombardier were all housed inside the wing. And it flew. Oh my, how it flew. I recall the day I first flew alongside it high above Muroc Dry Lake in California's Mojave Desert. The test pilot in the wing had instructed us to meet him at a certain point over the desert. You, he said, must be at 12,000 feet, and we'll be at 10,000, 2,000 feet below you. This is necessary, he added, if you are to see us. The wing, after all, looks like nothing more than a knife edge as you see it coming towards you in the sky. That is, if you see it. About 30 years ago, this reporter walked along this runway, much as I am right now. This is the Hawthorne Airport near Los Angeles, a relatively small municipal airport. I had come here at that time to report on a radically different airplane that promised to be the most exciting advance in military aviation since the development of the B-17 Flying Fortress and the B-29 in World War II. This is the home of the Northrop Corporation's aircraft division. They build airplanes here, they still do. And the aircraft I had come to see was the massive Flying Wing. It was called the B-49 by the U.S. Air Force. It was the product of the genius of John K. Northrop and his crew of engineers who had brought it to a point of development where it had been selected by the United States Air Force as the next generation bomber, the replacement for the B-29 that had carried the air war against Japan. The Flying Wing dated back many years. The first developmental work was done by John K. Northrop, Theodore von Karman, and William Sears. John Northrop and his fellow engineers and dedicated workers believed in their dream of a flying wing. They designed and built progressively better and larger versions until they brought it to a point where it was submitted to the United States Air Force as a possible replacement for the B-29. It flew in competition with these aircraft, the B-36s, and it won the fly-off. Orders were given to manufacture the first aircraft. A number of various versions were built and flown. Well, what happened when you had your fly-off, your competition?
General McNarney, who was the chief of the Air Force, walked into my office a morning in late June of 1948 and said, "You have won the competition. Here is an order for 35 additional aircraft." And I took a big breath and said, "Oh, that's wonderful." And he said, "That's only a drop in the bucket. We probably will need between 200 and 300 of these airplanes." The Air Force had previously put the B-35 through a series of acceptance tests. Actually, it went through twice because we had a fatal accident during the first final checkout, and the airplane was required to complete the whole routine again after that time. And the order for the additional airplanes came as a final approval, you might say, of the design, winning the competition.
There was great excitement at the Northrop factory. The dream had come true. The Flying Wing was on its way. What happened next has come to be regarded by those who were interested is one of the great mysteries of American aviation. For suddenly the contracts for the Flying Wing were canceled. The aircraft themselves, every last one of them, were ordered destroyed, and the order came from the U.S. government. And they were destroyed, each and every one of them. There is no example of the B-49 Flying Wing in the Air Force Museum at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, nor is it in the Smithsonian Institution. Now, what happened to the Flying Wing? Why was the government contract to build it suddenly canceled? Was it a good aircraft, or was it a faulty design? Why did the government order all the aircraft destroyed? In search for an answer to those and other questions, we have talked with many of the men involved in the design and testing of the B-49 Flying Wing. We have learned of 5 men who flight tested the wing during the developmental phase. 2 of them are dead. They died in the crash of a Flying Wing in 1949. The remaining 3 are retired Air Force General Robert L. Cardenas, retired Air Force Colonel Russ Schley, and retired Northrop test pilot Max Stanley. Max Stanley, you flew the Flying Wing. What did you think of it?
Well, I flew the Flying Wing, both the B-35 and the B-49, from the first flight of each airplane on through its entire program. And I felt that the airplanes could be described as normal airplanes, from the standpoint of its flying qualities, the field by the pilot, what it required to fly the airplane. No special skills were needed, and I thought that it was just a very fine flying machine.
There has been statements made that the aircraft was not as stable as it might be, that it would not have made a good bombing platform because it seemed to yaw, that is, kind of move from side to side in the air. Was that accurate?
Well, to a certain extent, yes. The airplane was somewhat deficient in directional stability. However, the Minneapolis Honeywell people developed what we call Little Herbert, a stability augmentation system that essentially corrected this problem. And I think that when you talk about the airplane being a suitable bombing platform, you should keep in mind that it was subjected to a very intense series of tests to determine its suitability as a bombing platform. It was flown by both the Northrop pilots and by the military pilots, and the conclusion of these tests was that it was a suitable bombing platform. It was acceptable.
It flew, as I understand, nonstop from Muroc, now Edwards Air Force Base, to Washington at one time. Did you make that flight?
Yes, well, I was what they call an observer pilot. Actually, the flight was made under the auspices of the Air Force, and the pilot in command was an Air Force pilot.
Retired Air Force General Robert L. Cardenas recalls his test flights.
It was rather heavy on the nose wheel. Once you got airborne, again, it was sensitive in pitch, but not overly sensitive, not a problem. Just sensitive, you had to be aware of it, not over control, in other words.
You felt comfortable with it?
Oh, I felt comfortable. First flight, you learn about it, and no real problem. Then once you were airborne, it was actually a pleasurable airplane to fly.
Performed remarkably, I think, when you consider that this was over 30 years ago, and it flew from then Muroc to Washington, I think it was 4 hours and 20 minutes, which is even pretty good time for today's airplanes.
What altitude was it?
It was flown from, as I recall, initially at 30,000 feet, and we gradually increased altitude to around 40,000 feet.
And that also compares with what is being flown today, does it not?
Absolutely.
Well, as a professional test pilot, you had no reservations about the Flying Wing then. You felt it was a dependable, well-designed aircraft, did you?
Yes, very definitely. The airplane, I'm speaking of the B-49 now, was essentially problem-free
Do you believe that continued research and development on the wing would have been worthwhile?
The R&D program would have had to been oriented towards the development of what now exists, digital flight control, fly-by-wire, which was not capable of being developed in that time. In other words, Mr. Northrop had a beautiful concept that was probably 20 years ahead of its time. And I got to make clear that I have never said it was unstable. It was marginally stable. I say it's stable, not unstable. Marginally stable about the vertical axis, or yaw, and about the lateral axis, or pitch.
Retired Air Force Colonel Russ Schley.
It had certain shortcomings and advantages as well. As far as it being a bombing platform, the bombs were not stable when they came out of the bomb bay, and we never did get very good accuracy with the airplane. From a stability standpoint, it still needed further development.
Did you feel at that time that they were on the road to solving those problems of stability?
Oh, I think anything could be solved given enough effort, time, and money. In this particular case, certainly it could have been solved.
40 years ago, Hugo R. Pink, now manager of the Test and Evaluation Aircraft Group for Northrop, worked on the flying wing. We asked him how he felt about the aircraft.
The airplane needed a stability augmenter, and one was being developed and was quite successful before the program was canceled. So the problem that the airplane had been solved. And of course, with the equipment that we have today, it would be duck soup. I think we'd have a much more efficient air transport aircraft today if we had continued the wing development.
D.G. McNeil today is manager of the Advanced Production Aircraft Group programs at Northrop. He has strong memories of the wing 40 years ago.
You believed in it?
We believed in it.
Didn't have any questions in your own mind about its flying ability?
No questions.
On the basis of what we've heard, the flying wing seems to have been a structurally sound, potentially highly useful aircraft for the U.S. Air Force, probably capable of fulfilling its role as the next generation bomber. So, what happened to it? 85-year-old John Knudsen Northrop, the man responsible for its design, an engineer who has perhaps had his hand in the design of more American aircraft than anyone else, tells the story for the first time.
Well, it's a very strange story and perhaps difficult to believe, but it certainly is seared into my memory, and I'm quite sure I can give you the absolute facts as they occurred. The same day that General McNarney, who was the military chief of the Air Forces, came to my office with that additional order for 35 airplanes, which he said was a drop in the bucket as far as the ultimate order was concerned. Mr. Millar and I were requested to visit Mr. Symington. At that meeting, he lectured us rather lengthily on the difficulties of a Secretary for Air in keeping things in hand, and told us that he did not want to sponsor any new aircraft companies entering the business and having to be supplied with business over the years, and that he wanted us, without question, to merge with Consolidated Vultee, which was then operating a government-owned plant in Fort Worth, building the B-36 as a competitor for the B-35 or the B-49. After the lengthy diatribe on Mr. Symington's part, I said, Mr. Secretary, what are the alternatives to this demand you were making of our merger with Consolidated Vultee. He said, alternatives, you'll be goddamn sorry if you don't. General McNarney said, oh, Mr. Secretary, you don't mean the way the way it sounds. And Mr. Simonton said, you're damn right I do. Well, this was a rather staggering termination of the meeting.
Seeking confirmation of John Northrop's recollections, we talked to Richard Millar, who in 1949 was chairman of the board at Northrop.
Mr. Millar, what happened at that meeting with Secretary of the Air Force, Mr. Symington, the one that Mr. Northrop's already told us about?
We were, in effect, directed to negotiate or work out a merger with Northrop and Convair. Jack Northrop asked the question, what if we don't merge? And Mr. Simon was quick to reply that we'd be damn sorry if we didn't. We were told to get together with Mr. Odlum to work out a basis for merger. I might say parenthetically that when Mr. Simon said that in effect we must do it, and be sorry if we didn't, General McNarney spoke up and he said, as I recall, Mr. Simon, you don't mean that, do you? And Mr. Simon said, in effect, yes, you damn right I do.
And Mr. Millar and I had nothing in the world to do except to visit Floyd Odlum, who was the monetary head at that time for Consolidated Vultee, and talk to Mr. Odlum about a merger. Unfortunately, neither Mr. Millar nor I remember the terms that Mr. Odlum offered us. We felt them grossly unfair to Northrop because of the fact that we had all the business, they had none.
Nothing substantial, nothing that came out of that and that would encourage the belief that we were within miles of any kind of an agreement as to the relative values of the two stocks. We seemed to be so far apart that there was no point in having any further conversations.
Was there any activity at the Convair plant at that time?
It said at the Fort Worth plant, I think practically none. It was virtually empty.
You did not accept Mr. Odlum's offer, I take it.
No, we did not accept Mr. Odlum's offer, and we didn't feel that we could, in fairness, do so.
So what happened?
I got a telephone call a few days later from Mr. Symington. He said, I am canceling all your flying wing aircraft. And I said, oh, Mr. Secretary, why? And he said, I've had an adverse report, and hung up. And that was the last time I ever talked to him, and the last time we could ever reach him by phone or any other way.
Did he give the contract to someone else?
He continued the construction of the B-36 by Consolidated Vultee in Fort Worth.
So, in fact, the contract was taken away from you and given to Consolidated because you had refused to merge with Consolidated as you were ordered to do by the government. Is that accurate?
That is absolutely accurate.
We were saying to ourselves, we wonder what's going to happen now. In other words, we're going to find out if Mr. Simon was bluffing. Well, he wasn't. The contract was canceled quickly. And as part of the cancellation, instructions were issued to destroy the 7 airplanes in various stages of construction out on the apron of the plant. And those airplanes were destroyed in front of the employees and everybody that had their heart and soul in it. No reason was given for the extraordinary
order. No explanation was forthcoming as to why at least they didn't save one or two for continued experimental flights, study. The order was very firm: destroy them and destroy them immediately. It was a very bitter experience, to say the least.
The villain in the death and destruction of the B-49 Flying Wing, according to John Northrop and Richard Millar, would be the then Secretary of the Air Force, Stuart Symington. Editorial fairness demands that Mr. Symington tell his side of the story at this time. We invited him to do so. Speaking to us only through his secretary, the former Air Force civilian chief declared that he never did that sort of thing and declined to appear in this report. Mr. Northrop, in reading your testimony before the House Committee on Armed Services during their 1949 B-36 hearings, I find you were asked, in effect, if you had any knowledge or knew of any Northrop officer who had been told that Northrop's business would suffer if it failed to merge with Consolidated. And you answered, I have no such knowledge. And you were asked if Mr. Odlum or Mr. Symington ever made such a statement to you, and you answered, no, sir. And you agreed with the attorney at that time that such a statement would not be truthful. What is your reaction to that now?
My reaction is that under pressure of the life or death of Northrop Corporation, I committed one of the finest jobs of perjury that I've ever heard.
You did not tell the truth.
I did not tell the truth.
And the reason for doing that was?
The reason for doing that was fear of the Secretary, the Air Secretary, Mr. Symington, fear of his complete obliteration of Northrop Aircraft Incorporated, which was struggling with what little was left of the business of aircraft manufacture after he had canceled the Flying Wing venture in toto.
How does it happen, Mr. Northrop, that for 31 years this story has not been told?
The reason the story has not been told for that length of time is the same as the initial reason for my perjury. And it was the fear of the company or the company management that any intimation of this circumstance would result in a complete cancellation and an obliteration of the company.
Mr. Millar, while you were chairman of the board, and after the cancellation of the B-49 contract, did you have any fear of reprisal that might be suffered by Northrop at the hands of the Air Force if in any way the Secretary of the Air Force might be offended, might be questioned?
Well, the only honest answer I can give to that is yes. And it was a pretty widespread feeling that Northrop's fate might hang in balance. As far as I was concerned, that I had the feeling, and I think it must have probably grown out of the fact that the meeting with Mr. Symington was so, shall I say, brutal, barefaced. So obviously, if you will, a power play that you almost had to assume that he would be prepared to take further steps if we didn't go as good boys and go along.
What kind of a contribution would the Flying Wing have made to aviation if its normal development had been permitted? It was a great load carrier, as I recall.
I believe I gave you a copy of NASA letter on this subject, which indicates that NASA confirms our present estimates as to what the airplane will do and considered it a coming design. They said in effect...
Essentially what the NASA letter says about an aircraft built more than 30 years ago is, we have, in effect, rediscovered the flying wing. Obviously, we recognize the pioneering Northrop work in that area as an essential source of information. And in the course of our investigations, we re-examined considerable NACA B-35, B-49 wind tunnel data. Our analyses confirmed your much earlier conviction as to the load carrying and efficiency advantages of this design approach. And studies performed for us by the major manufacturers of large airplanes have further corroborated these findings.
32 years after the flying wings were destroyed, the Air Force is talking about the same kind of aircraft, the same philosophy of design for the year 2001. The question might properly be asked, how much has military aviation in America been set back by the destruction of the flying wings?
One has the feeling that only the surface has been scratched in the story of the B-49 flying wing. The disturbing fact remains that a revolutionary aircraft design was apparently short-circuited in the development program of American aviation, a design that, in the words of NASA, has only recently been rediscovered and might well represent the next form of large cargo aircraft. There are overtones of politics and big business power plays that appear to have affected the revolutionary aircraft that was the product of the genius of John Knudsen Northrop. The B-49, the flying wing, now little more than a memory. This is Cleet Roberts reporting.
This Monday evening, we'll look at the troubles in Ireland through the eyes of the Irish Americans who support the IRA on Frontline, Monday night at 10.